bringing fantasy to life in Final Fantasy 15. If you're looking for bringing hell to life, you are in the wrong room. That's in 2002. I'm not even making that up. That's going on right now. So my name is Dan Inoue. I'll give you a quick background on me. I was born and raised in New York, and I bounced back and forth to Japan for a while before landing at Square Enix about 12 years ago. And for the last couple years, I've been leading the team responsible for the English language content in Final Fantasy 15 and its companion projects. I'll warn you up front that there are spoilers ahead, but there's also a section on why the spoilers don't really spoil anything, so I hope you'll stick with me. And we'll start with Final Fantasy. So I'm guessing everyone here kind of has an idea and has heard of Final Fantasy, but what is it? For 30 years, Final Fantasy has reinvented itself and rebuilt itself anew with each iteration. So every time it's new characters, new worlds, new gameplay, new combat, often fabulous hair, but it's never the same game. So what defines a Final Fantasy game? Well, one answer is its lore. More precisely, the way the lore of each entry kind of co-ops monsters and magic and mythos from different traditions. You have the Babylonian next to the Celtic, next to the Chinese, next to Greek mythology, without any regard for the dogmatic baggage that comes with it. So Final Fantasy kind of draws on these for inspiration without any limitations. And so many years ago, when this project began, it was built on a simple premise, a fantasy based on reality, which is a significant proposition because reality has never really been the series' focus. So, of course, all fiction is to some extent based on reality. On the surface, the intent here was a modern take, sort of a real-world setting with touches of high fantasy. But in time, with the companion projects and promotion, it added an extra dimension of reality, and the project kind of developed a life of its own. So, at the core of everything is the game, which follows Prince Noctis and his three close friends as they leave home on a journey. It begins with an open-world exploration of the continent and then gradually assumes a linear format as the story progresses. The film, Kingsglaive, recounts the events that unfold in the Crown City as the prince is away, centering around his father, the king, his paramour, Luna, and the titular Kingsglaive, the defenders of the city. So the film was released about a couple months ahead of the game's release in theaters, and the events of the film occur parallel to the first chapter of the game. The anime, Brotherhood, references the bond between the prince and his friends. So as hinted at in the panels here, the story opens with the gang on the road and then tells the story through flashbacks from their boyhood. So the series began streaming on YouTube roughly a half year before the game's release, with one episode each month in 5 installments. So these weren't kind of thinly related spin-offs or throwaway side stories. These were threads of a simultaneous narrative woven together across media. We couldn't assume everyone in our audience had seen all the companion projects, or even any for that matter. So this represented a big challenge, building integrated yet independent narratives and forming a coherent and cohesive reality. So that's the intro, and with that in mind, here's the breakdown of this talk as told in 3 acts. First, I'll start off by introducing some of the tactics and techniques we use to bring realism into our work, and in the second act, I'll discuss how realities of development and promotion got in the way of these plans, and finally, we'll wrap it up with some observation about what it all means. So Act 1 is the best laid plans. So on any project, our first task is to anchor our reality in our static material, our setting, our characters, and our lore. Final Fantasy is a Japanese-developed franchise, but the reality basis meant it was more important than ever that we ask ourselves, how would this be done in the West when making our linguistic choices? One thing that made this Final Fantasy different from others also was the fact that it was set to launch simultaneously in 12 languages. As there would be no lead time to perform the usual localization tweaks, it meant that the game had to be global from the ground up. So just as the ecology and nature of the game borrowed from real-world sources, so would the cultures. So the world of Eos features 4 distinct civilizations with their own architecture, lifestyles, and written languages. Pictured here is Altissia, the Walls of Water. It's sort of a reimagined Venice, and in line with that flavor, our Italian translation team was called on to help in naming the locales and helping with the signage. Here we see a scene from the continent, which uses English as a base with sort of French and Gaelic leaning spellings. Now, normally localizing art assets is unwise and a headache, and most fantasy games rightly opt to use iconography or illegible text. But one of the kind of benefits and luxuries of having a multicultural, multilingual in-house translation staff is that it let us review things early on so that we could globalize them. And incorporating this sort of semi-real world languages into the world helped build that road trip aesthetic and make the trip familiarly foreign for all audiences. And so I have just a quick aside here, which is that I want to stress the importance of consulting native speakers when working with foreign cultures, especially when in real world or real world based fictional settings, because especially when shows or games they do the Japanese season and they use the Japanese setting, it's usually laughably inauthentic. And I realize that stories cater more to people's perceptions than they do necessarily realities, but it's 2017 and the internet will call you out. You will be exposed. So be sure to ask a native speaker when you're working in another culture. So next up, this also goes to that point on the divide between perception and reality. While we added plenty of uniform local color to the continent of Lucis, the English-speaking content, this wouldn't fit with the kind of modern metropolis of its capital, the Crown City. So we have some cool concept art here, and the Crown City is a cultural amalgam. Our art team consciously intended to show it as street scenes from the world over. So you can see bits of London, New York, Paris, and Tokyo, kind of depending on the angle you look at it from, to make it feel both familiar and foreign to a worldwide audience. And to give it that same kind of diversity linguistically, we employed accents according to social circle more than geographic origin, which gave it a more modern feel than the classic all dwarves are Scottish fantasy trope. So ultimately, I can't say definitively whether this enhanced or diminished the reality for the audience at large, but it did give us the freedom to assemble a really great transatlantic cast. So that was one plus of this decision as well. And so the next aspect might strike you as a little too real. The astute viewer may have noticed a fair amount of product placement in these shots. So yeah, some of you will find this jarring. The lines between reality and fantasy become very blurry here, and the specter of commercialism looms kind of large over artistic merit. So these imports from beyond the fourth wall may be hard to explain away in canon, but they do make the world more kind of recognizable and familiar and more real to a good segment of the audience, and so that's what I tell myself at night. When it came to hawking cup noodles in the game, we did it kind of tongue-in-cheek because we definitely wanted to respect our audience's intelligence, and we thought it was a playful tap on the fourth wall, so hopefully they enjoyed that. And moving on to characters. So relatable characters can make or break your reality. And so, yeah, I joked about it earlier, but identifying with spectacularly coiffed JRPG heroes can be a real barrier to entry for a lot of players. And the fancy schmancy names don't always help. So we rely on touchstones to kind of turn foreign tropes into more relatable people for our audience. And here's the core four for our main story. On the far left is Ignis. He's the suave brains of the operation, sort of James Bond in the great outdoors. Next to him is Prompto, the funny fast talker, kind of a zanier Ferris Bueller. On the far right is Gladio, who's a younger John McClane from Die Hard. And I'll get to the rock star in the middle in a second, but who wouldn't want to take a road trip with James Bond, Ferris Bueller, and John McClane? So writing with established reference character voices in mind isn't exactly a cutting-edge technique necessarily, but it's especially critical in a localization. Obviously, you tinker with the archetype, but it provides a compass that keeps your character directed for your audience through all the cultural clutter. And another key point here is that the analogs aren't sidekicks. Each one has his own brand of cool. Each can carry his own story. Each is the normal one in his own mind. And so it really keeps the give and take fresh because they all feel they're right. And so here's a little side story about Noctis's character. I always use scripted characters for my references, and I avoid using real people because real people you don't know them as well as you think you do necessarily, and so I just always prefer to use characters. So I knew who he wasn't. He wasn't going to be the whiny, emo JRPG character, but whose voice was it? And I was actually talking to the Japanese voice actor for Noctis, who one night told me that his inspiration was sort of Kurt Cobain, who's kind of sweet at heart, but always on edge, and this rock star who scorns the spotlight. And it really clicked for me. It was kind of an epiphany. And so this is my one exception to my only using scripted character rules. And so if you have the opportunity to talk to your Japanese voice cast, it's a great place for ideas. Failing that, your English voice cast can give you a lot of input into the characters. And so, yeah, if you do have voice actors, definitely use them. They know their characters kind of as well as we writers do. Next up, so one bonus of having these independent backstories and flashbacks is that it added persistence to the universe and to the characters. And so each story had its self-contained arc, but when you put them together, they formed these life arcs for the characters. And this really added psychological depth to the characters. So if you go into the game alone, Noctis starts off as kind of a disenchanted youth who embarks on a journey to overcome sort of self-doubt. But when we see him as a kid, he's actually a really happy kid. And we see the events that kind of cause him to become the disenchanted youth we meet later. But together, when you take his childhood story and the story we see in-game, it forms this story of recovering lost innocence, which is kind of beautiful. And similarly with Prompto, there's some stories of his insecurity in Brotherhood, and that gets reprised in sort of a heart-to-heart conversation he has later. And so this is kind of that independent yet integrated at best. It's both stories stand on their own, but it gives you kind of a deeper appreciation when they connect. And the last point is a little more technical. So Final Fantasy 15 is a road trip where you spend a lot of time hanging out with your friends, and that feeling really needed to be immersive. So we devoted a lot of our energy to creating this conversational chemistry. Making the friendship feel real was kind of the heart of the player experience, and these are some of the formula we applied. This is very early, but early on we defined the interpersonal dynamics and kind of personalized them by equipping each with his fair share of nicknames for the others. We also kept little background speech tics and idiosyncrasies for them, like generally avoids contractions, never says he's sorry, and that sort of thing. Establishing these kind of behind-the-scenes rules was really invaluable given that we had multiple writers working on the project and it was across media. So it was good to have these background rules that we could refer to. We also used linguistic techniques to flesh them out. To bring home the kind of casual and comfortable feel of the characters, we tended to drop subjects whenever possible, and we also leaned on our voice actors for organic nonverbals, those little mumbles and clicks and squeaks that can be tricky to script. So along with breathing life into the characters, these tricks helped us hit our line timings because every line in the game had to match the Japanese timing precisely. So that was really invaluable for keeping it sounding natural. And then the last thing I have here is another technique we use to mimic real-world speech that I call Sorkinization. Where each line picks up on or directly ties into the words of the line before, where you borrow a word to start a line, or spit it back with a little twist, or expound on a metaphor, or kind of mimic the delivery. So picking up recently heard words is something natural to language that we all do kind of unconsciously, and done in moderation, it can add a natural feel to the dialogue. Of course, if you overdo it, you get a little too much Sorkin in it, but yeah, use in moderation would be my advice. And lastly, for our plans, I wanted to talk about our plans for lore. So Final Fantasy developed an unfortunate reputation for kind of delving into the esoteric with its cosmology and for inundating players with unpronounceable proper nouns. So we wanted to keep the lore rich. We wanted rich lore, but needed to make it accessible. So we built an on-ramp here. And so we focused on the layman's kind of understanding of lore and made sure that we could couch it in easy-to-digest terminology. So we use terms like gods, demons, messengers, oracles, things that the average person on the street had heard of. Our summoned characters, which every Final Fantasy names differently, were called astrals. So we basically made sure that everybody could be clear on the basic ground rules for lore. And then to prevent it from becoming too flat, we added in some flair in the forms of cryptonyms and kennings. So pictured here is the astral Titan, who's also known as the god of Earth, and that's how most of the people of the world refer to him. But every now and then you'll hear him called the Archean, or Land Forger, for a more kind of eloquent style, depending on the context and who's talking. So that was one way we kind of dolled up our lore, and one other mode I personally enjoyed working on was our surreality. And this is one example of some things we did to kind of bring home a surreal feel. So here we see Gentiana, a messenger who is in fact, spoilers, the avatar of the ice goddess Shiva. I'm sorry if that spoiled it for you. Sorry. To keep her shrouded in mystery, we wrote her dialogue to not use you or I, and it really created that sort of otherworldly, detached feeling. We kind of stole a page from Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, Jaqen Hagar. That's kind of how he talks. But we did it in a little different way, and it worked really well for her. So we kind of stretched it out to all our gods, that they wouldn't use those direct subjects, and would give them kind of a detachment from humanity, which worked really well in monologues. But it made writing dialogue really, really difficult because obviously the person they're interacting with has to understand it as well. And it took a lot of polishing to get right, but it was fun to do. Beyond the structure, the diction we used was also chosen to convey that eerie feeling that something beyond our understanding is happening. So using interpretive language in our god scenes and our dream sequences gave more weight to the words. So for instance, the Japanese might literally state that the astral gods have granted you their power, which we rendered as the stars shine for you now, which accomplishes the goal of the point and allows for deeper interpretations and also kind of adds depth to our cosmology as well. So we really enjoyed using that sort of interpretive dialogue as a tool. So those are some pages on our playbook for establishing reality and surreality, and I realized that nothing I've described so far is particularly revolutionary or game-changing. Many of you have probably employed similar techniques in your own work. What inspired me to give this talk, however, was observing how some of these traditional tried-and-true tactics proceeded to backfire as the project progressed. So this act is in two parts, covering the wacky adventures of production and the zany mishaps of promotion. So remember that bit I did on character chemistry and sorkinization? That worked out fine for our cutscenes and set pieces, but as it turned out, some of our pieces weren't so set. And after we completed our recording for the episode Duskai demo, we observed something interesting. Part of our AI team's plan to maximize our voice assets had been to concatenate the lines. On the left here is the conversation metrics that they used, and on the right was a snippet of the original Linear Studio script that we had submitted. And this wasn't a branching dialogue tree, but also not entirely random. The patterns were defined, but the same voice line could appear in very different mini conversations, with different lines preceding or following, and sometimes no lines. So after all the effort we'd put into making our characters sound as human as humanly possible, the conversations started to kind of sound like robocalls. So making an interchangeable dialogue system work in text is hard enough. Set aside our lofty intentions of having the characters pick up on each other's lines. And simply making the subjects and predicates agree grammatically was going to be difficult. So to pass the Turing test, we worked with our AI team and we established a couple ground rules. The first was to separate the lines that would launch a conversation for tonal difference. Secondly, we worked on mapping out the specs linguistically because Japanese doesn't use plurals and treats subjects differently. And lastly, we needed to be able to stretch any permutations that weren't working because you always need a kind of a safety clause. And our AI team was great about helping us with it, and it turned out really well. It was pretty organic. It was better than I expected. Our banter was actually really well received, and some of it was scripted, and some of it was this sort of organic concatenation. And it really sounded like when you're on the road with your friends for too long, and you just kind of, your mind's in the distance. So it came across really authentic in that way. So, as stated earlier, the Final Fantasy XV universe didn't feature spin-offs with only a few touch points. Everything was interwoven. So with 3 separate production teams for game, film, and anime, you run into some continuity issues. So I'm not going to rip any of our minor stitches into plot holes right here, but we did make sure to cover all our logistics and details in the background at least, hopefully. So while we managed to reconcile those details, there were kind of larger continuity concerns that grew as the universe was expanding. Namely, how does this all fit together? So here you see dudes around a campfire, tense confrontation with royalty, an illustrated boy petting a dog, and a transforming flying car. How do these people talk to each other? It simply wasn't practical to have one overarching style that would apply to everything. So if we couldn't have that, at least we needed to have contiguity, which is to say, maintaining suspension of belief at the seams where technobabble met the arcane or where high fantasy met casual banter. And we actually encounter one of these in the very first scene of our game, as Regis, a character with a high fantasy tone, as established in the film, is sending off Noctis, aka Kurt Cobain. We found this, we found the key to connecting their speech was to build off the emotional father and son dynamic and let the emotional content kind of supersede the stylistic. We found this with other characters as well. When you draw on the relationship, it kind of overwrote whatever stylistic conventions you were trying to build beyond that. So it kept the characters in the same scene and indirectly in the same world. And the last production tested time I have is pretty straightforward. For authenticity, we cast kids for our trial roles, and they turned in amazing performances. But as our production schedule lagged on, we did get a little nervous. Just remember that your in-game kids will be young forever, but your voice actors will grow up, and plan accordingly when you schedule. So this was the intricate space-time tapestry of our rollout. And you'll notice I've included trailers in here. Most of us would not consider PR as part of our story. Traditionally, the story is the part that is permanent, the thing that will be left decades after the dust is cleared. Promotion is an ephemeral phenomenon. It happens, and then it dies. But now more than ever, games are also phenomena. They are experiences to which context is integral. And they may have metas, they'll probably be patched, and they'll definitely be memed. So nowadays, games happen, and that's true even for single-player games. So we'll start at the beginning. In the writing of any book, film, or game, there looms the specter of those critical early questions we have to ask ourselves. So what? Who cares? And why does any of this matter? And more audiences attempt to kind of answer these questions by overanalyzing trailers. So prior to the release of the previous slide, before our regional marketing was really up and running, the majority of news and promotion for the game was coming out of Japan in the name of global promotion, where English content was being plugged into Japanese trailers. So as I mentioned earlier, we tend to rethink things from the ground up in our localizations. But we'd always done this on the assumption that the information would be conveyed in the classic style, i.e., when the player starts playing the game. So while our character naming and accenting decisions were being made with a larger background exposition in mind, the audience wasn't seeing this, and the global promotion and English exposition were out of sync. So we needed to prevent the misunderstandings from melting down the internet. Communicating with our regional marketing teams, once we got them up and running, and knowing their promotional schedules and messaging, let us better kind of contextualize our content for our audience and tell a more cohesive story. And they also helped cover for us, like in the demo where we had the term Archean, but we didn't have the term Astrals yet, and people thought that the Archeans were the summons when they're really the Astrals. I know it's a minor detail, but it's a huge deal. And our marketing was really good about contacting the community and getting the kind of fans to get on board with the correct terminology. So we owe them one for that. So we worked on a lot of things for them also. We were looking at their figurine box descriptions and Latin American launch events and commercial newspapers that would probably get screen capped and soundtrack titles. And we really ended up looking at a lot of stuff, but that's kind of all part of maintaining the universe. So one danger, however, of being steeped in your game's promotion so much is that you lose sight of the players who come in blind, those who haven't been following the news or watching the companion projects. So how do you bring that audience up to speed without alienating or boring your avid fans? So there's no easy answer for this. I'm not sure we found the solution. There's just so many permutations of the storytelling, and having an open world format, it only adds to the chaos. So first and foremost, the game's tale needs to stand on its own legs, and you write for the uninitiated audience. But that said, you don't want to kind of spoon feed people what they already know. And so one of the keys for us was to be nonchalant about our surprises and things, so that the people who already saw it coming wouldn't feel too kind of taken there. It also helps to be conscious of things like making sure you name drop in dialogue more than you would normally, and making sure any key plot points from other media would at least be available in ancillary text or interactive objects. So yeah, in Final Fantasy 15, we actually ended up with some kind of heavy-handed measures, like announcing characters' names on screen and a montage from the film. But your mileage may vary. We also had to be mindful of not overselling our reveals, because you don't want to rub in the dissonance that the player knows something that the character doesn't. Which brings me to my next point. So one of the earlier trailers for the game back in 2014 showed the invasion of Insomnia pretty much giving away the ending of the film, like I just did right now. But somehow it didn't spoil the story. A trailer at Tokyo Game Show 2 months before our release unveiled the main villain, which the player character realizes only halfway through the game. But this also didn't ruin things like I feared it might. And so I think this owes to the story's reliance on suspense over surprise. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with the Hitchcock parable about the bomb in a restaurant. If the bomb goes off without warning, you surprise the audience for 10 seconds, whereas if you let the audience know there's a bomb under the table, it'll go off at 3, and you put a clock in the back that says 2:45, you get 15 minutes of suspense. So spoilers really only spoil stories when the stories intentionally hide things or mislead the audience to hit them with a twist. I mean, you know that Caesar is going to die in the end, but you stay tuned to Julius Caesar to find out how. So in the age of internet crowdsourced theories, where kind of every outcome can be anticipated by someone, leaning on big twists is becoming less and less kind of tenable, unless you can completely fence your game experience off. So naturally, you need some surprises in your work. You don't want it to be too boring. But if you're relying on the big twist in 2017, it's not a good idea. Okay, so the meaning of life. Hold on, I skipped ahead one. So life is short, which is to say fleeting or finite. So Final Fantasy 15 wasn't really built for eternity. It's not going to be brought out of cobwebs and 100 years from now be ported to PlayStation 42. The language and reality present is very much a product of our time, and the experience is constantly kind of evolving to survive. My second point is that life is messy. I'm sorry, I didn't set this up good enough. So by meaning of life, what I mean by this is, when I said bringing fantasy to life as the topic for the talk, life is a very vague thing, and I realize a lot of people cop to it. So I wanted to talk about what life meant to me in the scope of Final Fantasy 15. So first being life is short, where obviously it's a product of its time, and then life is messy, being all the unpredictable things that happen on Final Fantasy 15. It doesn't really have emergent narrative, but it's also far from authorial because there's so many hands in it, both development side and promotional side. And so I'm not sure what it's going to look like a year from now, which is both frightening and exhilarating, a lot like life. And then my last point is that life is fun. So many cool things have happened that we didn't expect. Our voice actors play the game on Twitch, these forum debates and these hilarious memes, and our team is always taking it and finding ways to tuck it into the game. There was someone on our marketing team kind of butt-dialed a tweet once, and it was this random string of letters that got like 1 million likes. It was ridiculous. So we just took that and made it one of like in the mobile game, it's one of the random names it generates. So just being able to kind of tie those things together, it's been a lot of fun. And so all the missteps and successes along the way have made for an amazing ride. And so making the game was a lot of fun. I hope playing the game was a lot of fun. And talking here has been a lot of fun. So thank you.